All right, welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. I'm your host, Trisha Curtis, the CEO of PetroNerds.
And I am your co-host, Ethan Bellamy, Managing Director at East Daily Capital. We do the midstream. It's Sunday, January 24th. I'm in a fantastic mood. I had a very good brunch date this morning. Trisha, on the other hand, is not in a good mood. We'll get to that, but it's mostly because our new president has finished off Keystone XL, put a moratorium on oil and gas permitting and leasing for 60 days on federal lands and other agencies. So we'll get into that, but I'm going to start with a market recap. Is that all right with you?
Yes, and right. I'm always in a good mood, but yeah, I have plenty of ranting to go on here.
Okay, fair enough. It'll be the Trisha rant episode. So let's start with natural gas. Stunk up the joint this week, dropped 11%. The February contract retreated to $2.45. You know, we're halfway through the gas storage season, and we're behind about 7% above the 5-year average, 3 TCF in storage. Season to date draws are just shy of a TCF at 918 Bs. That's versus the 5-year average of 940 Bs. U.S. feed gas for LNG came off a little bit from the peak of 11.5 Bs a day. We were down to 10.9. Part of that is likely due to the fact that all the LNG tankers are, all that capacity sopped up and busy.
Yep.
So that's still pretty constructive. Oil was pretty much flat week on week, 52 and change for WTI, 55 and change for Brent. On the positive side, we saw the IEA in its monthly report cut first quarter 21 estimates by 600,000 barrels a day. Looking for 1.1 million barrels a day of draws against stockpiles every day this quarter. So that's fairly constructive.
The IEA also cut their demand outlook by a couple 100,000 barrels a day as well.
Yep. The Saudis cut February supply to Asia last week, said the same for Europe this week. Data indicate Iraq is looking better on OPEC compliance. The Chinese reported December throughputs, 70,000 barrels a day below the record set in November. Lockdowns in China are threatening demand. I think that was the biggest driver of the oil market in the latter part of this week, where both Middle East, Asia, and a little resurgence in China on lockdowns threatened demand. The DOE posted weekly build in crude of 4 million barrels a day. That was pretty bullish. However, pretty bearish. Refined products looked a little better. Both gasoline and distillate beat consensus. So the market response. Oh, I should also add the EIA drilling productivity report saw February at 7.5 million barrels a day. That's versus 7.6 in January. Down 90,000 barrels a day. This is for the major plays. Every basin except the Haynesville was down month on month. So constructive. So the market response. Bakken players with federal leases got punched in the nose. EOG was down 7%. The gas names got hit worst on the week. Range was down 15%. Southwestern was down 14%. Halliburton beat on the quarter, or 4 of roughly 70 stocks in the S&P oil and gas index reported all beat, nevertheless down 7% on the week. They did say that they expected the bottom of activity in international this quarter, which is nice. And then they were positive on the first quarter of North American activity. NOV was down 9%. They pre-announced weak EBITDA and soft demand. So the S&P oil and gas E&P index, better known as the XOP, that was down 2% this week. The Philly Oilfield Service Index down 4.4% this week. Alerian MLP Energy Index down 3% this week. And then refiners, positive 3.3% this week. So at least something was up. It was good.
I think refiners are positive, one, because they're refineries are going out of business. So the refiners that make it might be in better territory. I would also like to comment that the Like, so actual, if you're following just like EIA monthly production data for the US. So I guess when you say constructive, I mean, production is down. We're largely down. We're down to 10.5 million barrels per day as of October. And that's really coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, which we're going to get into more stuff on this moratorium of where we're going to see declines, but everything's sort of holding up. But or federal offshore Gulf of Mexico came down considerably from 1.5 million barrels per day in September down to 1 million barrels a day in October. So that was the biggest tip. I would also note that the weekly ending stocks, excluding the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and then the weekly ending stocks of crude oil and product, excluding Petroleum Reserve, both of them are in the right territory. So I thought the market was a little bit overly muted. I mean, the fact that prices didn't move down and there were concerns about lockdowns in China told us that we had drawdowns for the last 3 weeks in Cushing. Same for the petroleum products in the U.S. combined with oil. Those charts in the last 3 weeks look good. And that we've had, if you saw the IEA report, I mean, we are seeing at the end of last year, we were seeing material stock draws. We're seeing material stock draws now. And we were seeing all the supplies we mentioned before coming from Libya and all these places. So I think the market's in slightly better shape than a lot of folks in the market want to give it credit for. And obviously the Saudis are cutting 1 million barrels per day. So that's helping.
It's helpful. Very helpful. You were dead right on $50. The market feels like it wants to go higher here. If we didn't have this news out of China, I think we'd be pushing 55.
Yeah, and I feel like the fundamentals, if this was not, I don't know, the fundamentals are telling us it does want to go a little higher. And I think that's, as we talked about in previous podcasts, that should make people a little nervous. I mean, one, there's a number of complications with prices going too high too fast. There's a number of issues with production coming online, maybe not in the US, but around the globe. And in theory, the way the numbers are working out, it should go a little higher, but it doesn't. We're kind of stuck right now. I think part of that's the reality that the Saudis are holding the bag right now. I mean, they did do 1 million barrel a day cut, and I do think that if you listen to our previous podcast, I think the market has missed this by a long shot of really dissecting and interpreting how the Saudis thought about the market and how the Russians thought about the market, and the fact that they're just not quite on the same page, but they're working through this together.
All right. So should we move to the elephant in the room?
Yeah, we really should. And we have there's a lot of market talk we'll get into here because
I was going to talk about Axel coating my arm with saliva before we got started. Okay, no, we can.
Yeah. Ethan's making great progress with Axel. So it's great. So the elephant in the room, I mean, is obviously this was a busy week for the Biden administration. And I was thinking back about this when I've worked through, I've over 10 years of experience, and I was in DC during the Obama administration and had worked with government agencies, worked with Department of Energy during that time. So I think I have a pretty decent understanding of how Obama dealt with crude oil production in the U.S. and Keystone XL was just happening there. So I literally cut my teeth. The first projects I ever worked on was Keystone XL in North Dakota. And I went to a conference in D.C. at the Four Seasons, and it was called Greening of the Canadian Oil Sands. And it was before anyone even knew what Keystone XL was. And I worked for this tiny little think tank called the Energy Policy Research Foundation. And we started working on this pipeline nobody had heard of, just because we did economic, policy, and technical analysis. And we talked about this Keystone XL pipeline of like, hey, this is a pipeline that goes from Alberta all the way to the Gulf Coast, and it takes increasing volumes of oil sands, which we were demanding, and it brings it to the Gulf Coast refineries, and it was a perfect match for the crude quality type. It actually made a lot of sense economically. There was a number of reasons why it sort of made sense, and then over time, obviously, became controversial, got a lot of pushback, and so this first week, the first day in office, actually within hours, Biden axed the Keystone XL pipeline, made great friends with our northern neighbors who were very keen on that. They were super excited about that answer. And that cost, I think the numbers I've heard were everything from 8,000 to 12,000 jobs that will be pink slips like immediately that people are getting that were actually working on the construction of the pipe. And that's like lost. It's lost capital. This pipe was already purchased. It's literally was being constructed and built and put into the ground. And by the way, Keystone XL is like, Keystone is actual pipeline that's in the ground. Keystone XL is an extension. Part of Keystone XL was actually running. Obviously, the bulk of the extension will not be built and won't work, but it's not as though that one Keystone doesn't exist or that parts of Keystone XL doesn't exist. So this was extremely symbolic and does not do anything in terms of an emission standpoint. In fact, it probably increases emissions. I would argue that it definitely increases emissions because it means that more crude will have to go via rail. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. So stop stealing my thunder. I'm the midstream guy here. But
Yes, sir.
I know you know everything.
Midstream macro.
That's
This
fine.
is how Ethan and I
That's
met.
fine.
Was
It's fine.
on the midstream circuit.
So yeah, I mean, so first the first thing we should say is, based on our analysis, the market does not need the capacity of Keystone XL. That being said, it does take away shipper optionality and leverage, and it makes the other routes more vital for Canadian exports, because you can't start taking other pipes out of service or stop doing some of the other projects that need to be done as easily as if you had this other line. The main thing about it that I have a problem with. So let's set aside the very marginal prospective temperature increase that would come from constraining oil sands production, hypothetically in the future, based on some hyper complicated model of global temperature. We'll see. And let's just talk about energy security, because, let me be very clear. I like the Canadians more than just about anybody else that doesn't have an American flag on their passport. That's our number one trade partner. We should be working interdependently with both Canada and Mexico on making sure we have secure, low volatility energy supply, particularly for our refiners that need to process heavy. And I'd much rather be getting those volumes from Canada than from some other place that we don't necessarily want to finance or enable, and that's less reliable. So to me, that is the key element of this that I think is missing. I think it was very symbolic, but I do think it's pretty unfortunate. Now, that being said, did the market anticipate it was going to happen? I think so. I mean, it wasn't in our model for TC Energy. And
I mean, it took so long for this to even. Yeah. I mean, this has been a decade. It literally has cost them $1 billion extra in permanent. It's cost $1 billion just to the processing of thinking about this pipeline. And I don't mean to steal Ethan's thunder, but we actually both worked on this. I remember seeing Ethan speak on Keystone XL. So one of the first times I saw him speak, and he was really good and very charismatic. But the sad thing about this is that we import 5.5 million barrels a day of crude oil in the U.S. right now, and that's down because of COVID, obviously. But we've always, all of our imports and exports, the majority of it comes from Canada, and we've always had cross-border trade. Was part of NAFTA, now is part of the new trade agreement. Which there are some legal stipulations for the Biden administration now, because they may be able to access pipeline, but I don't think they're going to be able to access crude by rail, because they may have some trade issues on the commerce side that they actually can't change. So this does directly benefit crude by rail in theory, and does therefore definitely increase emissions on that side if you're thinking about this being run by diesel. But that 5.5 million barrels a day that we're importing is 3.5 million barrels a day is coming from Canada, and we export a significant amount of crude to Canada, and we have, even before we allowed for crude oil exports, that was the one country that because we have that trade agreement with. So the cross-border pipelines that we have, both for crude oil and for product, I mean, this has been going on for decades, and this is Canada's a relatively unspoken friend often, and we don't give them enough credit. But in terms of how our system works for energy, it's extremely interwoven. So if you look at the reactions by Trudeau and the Canadians, they're not a unliberal country that does. I mean, they embrace climate change and they have measures and stuff in place for this, but they are very pissed about this, and rightly so, because this was something that they wanted to do, wanted to push through, and they're being told no within hours of taking office.
So what do Canada and New Mexico have in common?
What do they have in common?
I would say they've both got a problem with Joe Biden right now.
I think they both do. Yeah. I mean, New Mexico. Sorry, not Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, New Mexico. Yeah, they definitely both have a problem with Joe Biden. Depends on who. I was
just giving you a softball layup to just go into part B.
Sorry. I do want to close just one thing on Keystone XL before we wrap this up, is that from a production volume standpoint, so it's roughly, I think the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, they didn't update their numbers for last year, and they were using old numbers, but they had Canadian production, at roughly 5 million barrels per day. Is that about right? And that you guys have capacity that basically they're fine on technically Wilson Basin, but Western Canadian crude oil capacity is still in the clear right now. So it's only if production was to slowly ramp up over time that they would need an additional pipeline. So basically incremental volumes or volumes that want to chase arbitrage in different markets are going to go via rail.
Right. And I just go back to the idea that shippers don't have leverage. They have less or no optionality depending on where they are. And it forecloses the idea of incremental production if we do get to a $60 plus world where that we had the price incentive to, start up new oil sands production or increase conventional production. So I think you basically just have limited option value. That's the same phenomena that we see in the Northeast on gas in the Northeast U.S. So one of the other things, a little bit of a digression, we can come back to the other stuff from the president this week, but Mountain Valley also got a 2-2 deadlock ruling from FERC, where they did not get the ability to cross streams for the first 77 miles of the pipeline, I believe.
And that goes from, just remind the listener, that goes from where to where?
That's a Northeast egress pipe. And it is critical to allowing Northeast producers to produce above a given volume in the future. And unless you've got firm transportation capacity out of the basin, that's going to limit production from the Northeast. So we're actually in the middle. The excellent team at East Daily Capital, our analyst David Dubetz is working on this as we speak. I believe it is Sunday, so yeah, he's probably working to see what is the impact if we don't get Mountain Valley out of the Northeast on the long-term U.S. gas macro. So these, this is a common theme. It's a different commodity, but look, you cannot have limitations on resource access, whether that resource is coming from Canada or if it's coming from the Marcellus, and expect to have stable pricing. I mean, prices are going to go up. Now, I think the U.S. consumer has been an enormous beneficiary of fiscal stimulus by way of overinvestment in the shale business that has, that drove the shale boom, and nobody on the street appreciates that. But when you start to see higher home heating prices and higher fuel prices at the pump, and part of that can be very easily tracked back to limitations on resource decisions, that's going to come home roost to politicians. Everybody wants limitations on CO2 as long as they don't have to pay for it.
No, and they don't feel it. And no offense to this, I'm not gonna sit here and spend this podcast talking about climate change, because there's plenty of others that do that. But I think that you can't. I mean, this is an oil and gas podcast because that's what we're that's what our intelligence is on. And I think that if you have to realize that the world is still consuming, at least now, probably 97 million barrels a day of crude oil. And that 53 WTI that we had for the past several years, for the past 5 years in the run up to COVID, that's a huge deal. And I think it's incredible that, if you look at the run up in U.S. production, and we've mentioned this a million times before, but a lot of folks don't understand this run up from 10 million barrels a day to nearly 13 million barrels per day before COVID. And those million barrels a day on the global oil market really enabled the ability to sort of sanction and to have this geopolitical flexibility. Even under Obama, he was granted a lot of geopolitical flexibility in the Middle East to do what he wanted, because he wasn't beholden. He wasn't going to see a spike in oil prices. And he was afraid to allow crude oil exports because everybody was worried that if they allowed crude oil exports, oil prices would go up. And the same needs to be thought about. These politicians who are the folks in Congress that are behind Biden right now, they should be very concerned about the tens of thousands of job losses. One, we're seeing immediately by this. And then North Dakota's faced with the same thing. I think before we switch into New Mexico is that without Keystone XL, so Keystone XL may not be a problem on paper right now, but if the Dakota Access Pipeline is emptied, then you start having some severe issues that are not just for Canada, but also for North Dakota. And North Dakota has limited federal land, so it could see some upside there, but it can't if they empty that pipeline. And these are serious things where this is private land, this is money that's already been invested, and there will be legal ramifications. I mean, this will be battled out in the courts. It's not like these companies and these states are going to take this lying down. But I think we can easily segue now into the moratorium on, or the initial the suspension of on federal lands, which, by the way, wasn't just suspension of drilling and leasing on federal lands. We actually looked at and printed out the thing, because if you saw all the stuff that was going on Twitter and all these other things about the 60-day suspensions, which, by the way, Bloomberg barely mentioned it. The major media outlets sort of paid it lip service that there was a 60-day suspension on new leases. And what they don't appreciate is that, by the way, if you want to Google it, and it's hard to find, it's order number 3395. Google it and actually read it. And Wall Street Journal put out an editorial opinion piece this weekend that discussed and put a little snippet in there to discuss that it's broader than just actual federal lands. And that should make a lot of folks nervous, because they included Indian lands in there, which is kind of crazy, because Indian lands.
Do you have the letter from the Ute, which is
I have both.
Fantastic. I want to read the middle paragraph from the Ute. This is here. That's it right there.
No, here's what you want. There you go.
Yeah, that's what I want. Okay, so I thought this was great. So this is from the Ute Indian Tribe Business Committee in Utah, and this is to the acting Secretary of the Interior. And the middle paragraph here is fantastic, which is, your order is a direct attack on our economy, sovereignty, and our right to self-determination. Indian lands are not federal public lands. Any action on our lands and interests can only be taken after effective tribal consultation. So the consultation aspect, if you'll recall, on Dakota Access was a huge part of the pushback from the Standing Rock Sioux. And I mean, certainly, should it surprise anyone that you speak out of both sides of your mouth, if on the one hand you want consultation with a tribe, as long as they want to be restrictive on resources like the way you're arguing, but if they want to go the other direction, then maybe we're not going to consult with them. So
yeah, and I think it's just this is a absolute slap in the face to Native American tribal lands, of saying, because this actually they've referenced Executive Order 13175, and if you actually pull that up order, which was done in the year 2000, that's an executive order on the consultation and coordination with Indian tribal governments that basically is something to prohibit something like this happening, that you just don't force something down the pipeline. So in all fairness, I just don't think there's a whole lot of legal standing for them to even tell tribal lands what to do. And to be fair, Utah doesn't have, this is the Uinta and the Ute Indian tribe. So Utah doesn't have a ton. We're not talking about 20 million barrels a day of production, or tens of thousands, 20,000 barrels a day of production. It's not a ton of production, but we do have production in the Uinta Basin. And I think it's conceptually the idea of the sovereignty. This does have implications in North Dakota, where we do have some great rock within these tribal communities. And historically, it's been, dependent upon the operator and how well they've worked within these communities, and that should be how it is, if they have a good standing and how they work. Obviously, there was a huge issue with Dakota Access that was blown up, and it did have a lot of. I would say that a lot of folks within North Dakota were sort of split on this, and I think this is actually an opportunity for these states to merge together with these local tribal leaders and realize that they want to take back their sovereignty. I want to go back to the order as well, because the executive order is a temporary suspension of delegated authority, and that should make us a little bit nervous, because it's not a temporary suspension of just federal drilling and permitting. It includes that, but it includes a number of other things. And essentially, as this opinion article in the Wall Street Journal put it, this is a way that the Biden administration is forcing the hand of. So basically, you can't, if you are a delegated authority, and this implementation includes secretary, deputy secretary, solicitor, assistant secretary for policy management and budget, land, minerals and budget, water and science, fish and wildlife and parks, Indian affairs, and insular and international affairs. So basically, if you're under any of those categories, you can't approve anything. So it's not as though if it's on private land, but you still need approval from a higher authority, those folks are not allowed to approve anything for 60 days. And that, I believe, the intention, at least as I'm reading it and interpreting it, again, if this changes, could be wrong, that's fine. But the intention is to sort of force the hand of everyone in Congress to approve the cabinet members, because the acting secretary is not the person who did this on these lands. This isn't the Deb Haaland, who's going to be the Secretary of Interior. So that should be a huge wake up call to everyone that the acting secretary is doing this. And this is people even heard of, let alone the actual secretary. Because I can't even imagine what's going to happen on the day she walks into office and what she's going to do. This is going to make this look like child's play. And they clarified, I mean, they're...
But I thought you guys were Facebook friends.
I'm not even on Facebook. I think they clarified, the White House actually clarified that this is intention. They did intend this to be permanent. So if anyone's wanting to know in the oil and gas community whether or not this 6-day suspension is going to be permanent, it's full on intention. And I think it's important to call out, like I put out on Twitter and on LinkedIn this video that I had done with the Digital Wildcatters, and it was just me doing this rant on the implications of a Biden win. And I did this right before the election and told everyone this was going to happen. And a lot of people were like, oh, I just don't know if this is going to happen. Word for word, told them what was going to happen. It's happened now. And it's important I encourage you guys to take a listen to it, but it's important for people to think out like, these are the first couple days in office, and this is what's happened. And so they basically have put this 60-day suspension in place. Their intention is to do this long term. But it's important to also call out that when asked multiple times, both Biden and Harris were asked, are you going to ban fracking? And they weren't clarified, are you going to ban fracking on federal land? But they changed their answers multiple times, and they said they were. And now they're literally clarifying, the White House is clarifying, we full on intend to ban fracking on federal land. And that's I know politicians, change their minds and everything, but that's lying. So that's not exactly, I mean, that's what the oil and gas community is facing right now, is they were told one thing and another thing's happening. And this is a time where the economy is not doing well, where the industry was already hit massively. So these states are now faced with these states with federal land exposure, which is Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, where a lot of this production is from the Permian, all have massive federal land exposure and are all facing already declining state revenues, or already budgets that are already being hit. And now we're faced with this, knowing that they're not all these new permits are going to be suspended. And if you want to know if it's like impacting businesses, call up a company who has exposure on federal land and ask them how their last few days have been. Because one, they're not going to answer the phone because they're too damn busy, trying to figure out what their, legal moves and everything are. But I mean, it's a crazy firestorm. So this is not a small deal.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Well, look, I mean, a lot of this we knew it was coming. I think the rapidity of it is what has shocked people. There's definitely been, I think, maybe a little complacency about things.
The industry has certainly been a little complacent about this.
And to be fair, things have been extremely volatile, and you can be forgiven for having your head down and trying to figure out how to make payroll.
Yeah.
That's an issue, but collectively, people need to be aware of what's happening.
And I think the industry needs to do a better job of, like, the industry has historically put their heads down and sort of let things hit them. And this is not the time in which you do that. I mean, this is no different than when I'm speaking with the Saudis or folks abroad and explain to them, 10 years ago that the world was changing under their feet with shale. The world is changing right now. I mean, this is unprecedented moves within 2 days of administration. And to be fair, this could be that they know they're going to have pushback, so might as well shove it all through really fast. But you can already hear the murmur, on Capitol Hill that there is going to be pushback, because even Democratic constituents Democratic congressmen who may support these measures, they have constituents at home which may be losing their jobs. And as you pointed out in our previous conversations, when you impact local production, you typically impact local energy prices. So if you're like Texas is able to have, they have the lowest cost gasoline in the U.S. and they have very reliable renewable energy, because they can take natural gas and they can bring in wind power and everything from the grid. They have that because they have that production. So in New Mexico, where you have 1 million barrels a day production coming from 6,200 horizontal wells in Lea and Eddy County, which do have a lot of federal land exposure, that state could feel an impact. They're going to feel on jobs, and they're going to feel on state and local revenue, and the federal government's going to feel on not getting royalties, but they're also going to feel on not having that local production. And I mean, they're close to Texas, so they may have a feedback loop there, but it's a lot of jobs for the state, and it's just a ton of revenue.
Do you think that this is an easy decision to make, precisely because there are, in excess of 5,000 existing permitted wells out there, that the impact is really, how do you bend the curve of production, say 2 to 5 years out, rather than an immediate impact necessarily? It's one of those things like it's easy to say, hey, let's be carbon neutral in 2050 if your term is long over and you don't have to worry about, reaping what you've sown.
Yeah, that's a really relevant point. I mean, I think that if you listen to if you listen to a slug of different podcasts and you do research on China and stuff, even the authorities on experts on China, when talking about China's plan to do, be carbon neutral by 2060, even the people who are very promoting China doing this will say all those people are going to be dead in 2060, and it's a communist country, so they're not going to probably hit those emissions targets. Here, these are a strong agenda, and these are very symbolic moves. And this is stuff that they did campaign on. Now, did they campaign on directly on cracking down on federal, changing fracking? They did talk about federal land. So most of us knew that was coming, and they absolutely campaigned on Keystone XL. And so these are really, really symbolic moves. And I think the hope is that, hey, it is federal land, and they can say, well, we're not impacting everything else. But that doesn't seem to be the goal behind this. The goal behind this, you read Reuters to all these different articles. They estimate production between 10 and 25%. So nobody has the number perfectly right, because if you look at the federal land map, and I encourage you to just go Google it and you can see it's sort of intermingled. But the reality is that business doesn't operate in this clean little environment of like, okay, well, you've got 10% of your acreage that's kind of commingled with this, and it's not going to be a problem. It doesn't work that way. If you have that exposure, it shuts down business. And so, yes, we have tons of permits, but like EOG stock, as you mentioned in the opening, it got hammered this week because they have massive federal land exposure. Every company that's in New Mexico, which by the way is such phenomenal rock, and you wanted to be in New Mexico prior to this whole thing, all those companies are getting hammered because they have this exposure, and they didn't. Whatever permits they have now, they have. And the assumption is that you're going to be able to drill and complete those wells. And that's what they've sort of said, that it doesn't impact that. I'm concerned about that. And I think if you're in the oil and gas community and you're thinking about production, you should be concerned, because if in the first 48 hours in office, this is what you saw, I would not put past them to issue studies on air quality and on methane emissions and everything to make this harder. And even if you're thinking about production, you can get to a point if you're starting to think about production on federal land, so existing production, what are the ways it could be more difficult? It would be just increasing studies. And if you're a small producer in Wyoming and you have to pay a third party for additional studies, this gets really expensive, and it's a way to put folks out of business. So it's certainly a way for an administration to make a symbolic move for the world in saying, we are focused on what we can control. We're going to focus on production. And Biden did say that in his in that speech, in which he was asked directly, dealing in climate change and production. He said, we are going after production, and this is what they meant by that.
Now let's talk about the silver lining, though. Let's say you got PDP in the Midland Basin. Everybody else is declining. Your realized price is good because infrastructure is unused. The netbacks are great. Transportation costs are going down. We're limiting gas pipes coming out of gas basins in the Northeast, so your realizations on gas are going to go up. Maybe there's, if New Mexico starts to trend down, you've got, the same same oil field service capacity out there that's now available to you. So there's less competition for that. There are some folks who net are going to be better off.
Yeah, the silver lining to this, and we've discussed this before, and I talked about that in this video rant that I did. I think the benefits are the places without federal land and that have infrastructure. And so we're already seeing, and gas is going to benefit in places where natural gas does not have exposure to federal land. And we talked about this last pod, Haynesville's going to surge. And they're close, they have access to market. Eagle Ford, people are kind of ripping on the Eagle Ford. I'm betting right now, Eagle Ford will see a resurgence, not just in oil, but for natural gas activity, because especially if North Dakota gets hit unfairly with all this on the pipeline side. But for sure, New Mexico is actually, so the Permian Basin side of New Mexico is producing just shy of these 6,200 horizontal wells, are producing just shy of 1 million barrels per day. But the gas side is 3.5 BCF a day. So that's a lot of gas production from these wells. So certainly you're going to ease pipeline constraints. So you're gonna help both the crude and the gas side a little bit if you do that. And that means that all this activity, I mean, you are going to see concentrated activity within the southern part of the Delaware, just off the border. Gas probably is going to do well. So where Reeves County, which is historically not done too well, will probably do well on the gas side. And I think Midland, where we actually saw Midland doing pretty well this year, was because it's shallower. It's more known. It's more of a historical oil play. I mean, these guys know these old vertical wells. You have hundreds of thousands you have tens of thousands of vertical wells within the Permian Basin. And so the Midland is kind of a natural place to go when you know it. It's cheaper to drill and it makes sense. So you're going to have all kinds of resurgence just within the Permian Basin. And then I think on the Texas side, obviously, and then I think everywhere in Texas. I mean, I've talked about this before, but I think especially if this is supporting oil prices and oil prices are north of 50 sustainably. Now the publics, we are hearing a lot of nervousness, both from these public companies who just don't sound super clear on, what's the trajectory for the next 12 months. They don't seem like they're going to ramp up production. And I think foreign countries are really trying to understand this.
In fairness to those guys, though, it's probably pretty tough to figure that out, right?
It is. It absolutely is.
Who knows what could happen?
But I think if you want to think about the nuances of shale, you need to be following the publics in the Permian. You need to be following the privates and seeing what are they doing? Because this is an opportunity. If you're a private company and you aren't exposed on the federal landslide, your oil is north of 50. You're in a great spot. Yeah. So that's where I think that's the little bit of the silver lining. But I think overwhelmingly, it's just going to be, you're just clamping down on places where there's so much oil and gas production.
This is a great spot here for me to plug an East Daily product. We put out a report on a weekly basis on Friday called Data Insights. And this week we wrote about who the Delaware Basin gatherers are. And so if you want to watch for comments about the trajectory of New Mexico, which again, I don't think are this year. I think you start to see volume impacts much later on, but those would be from Lucid, which is a private operator, DCP Midstream, Enterprise, Energy Transfer, Targa, Western Gas, EnLink, and a few others. And probably also a good place for me to talk about our midstream activity tracker. One of the things East Daily does, which I think is incredibly valuable to understanding the midstream, is we allocate every rig to a G&P system in the U.S. And right now, the leaders in allocations across North America are Targa's got 42 rigs running on its system, followed by Energy Transfer, Enterprise, and West Texas Gas and DCP Midstream. So one private operator in there. So that's 42, 32, 27, 25, and 25 rigs respectively. And those are all well up from lows. Targa's systems had 25 rigs running in September and now have 42 as of the end of 20. So it's quite a change we've seen. These are monthly numbers. So we are seeing a North American comeback.
We are. And I think, we're not seeing though, if you look at Wilson Basin right now, rig count hasn't jumped super high and we're not seeing it go crazy. We are seeing the rig count overall go up. So we're seeing the rig count in obviously the Permian go up. We're seeing the rig count go up in these places. We haven't seen production in the Permian Basin recover to its pre-COVID levels, and it may take a little while, obviously, to get there. I think that regulatory uncertainty, though, depending on how strong it is, it really does impact investment decisions. You have all these permits and everything, but you also, that number I was saying, 3.5 BCF a day of gas, you have to have the takeaway for this. So if you don't have all the existing infrastructure built out, and by the way, these other regulations may impact the build out of infrastructure just within New Mexico, which could impact your existing permits in place. So it's not 100% clear to me that we won't, before the end of this year, that we won't see impact on activity. Maybe not exactly on production, but again, these are great wells and they're kind of monsters. 6,000 of them that are producing 1 million barrels a day. So, that's huge. And I think that if we're looking at overall production, a lot of folks are debating now on partly what the year is going to exit at. Are we going to exit 2021? Right now we're at 10.5 million barrels per day. We're still way down from what we were. So we have a lot of room to grow. And that in itself, 10.5 million barrels of production out of the U.S. has been being supportive of oil prices in the U.S. and globally.
Well, I think we have reached a natural conclusion to our podcast. You always want to keep talking.
I know, and you always like, oh, it's a natural.
Well,
natural
no. It's the Tao of Steve. Be brief, be excellent, be gone.
I like it.
All right. Well, I am your co-host, Ethan Bellamy. This is PetroNerds podcast number 4. It's been a pleasure, Trisha Curtis.
Yeah, it has been a pleasure. We thank you guys for listening, and we don't know exactly when this will be released, but the date is January 24th. So this is sort of timely. We encourage you to listen to the older podcasts, and we will have new ones out shortly.
And thank you to Digital Wildcatters. You might want to listen to Colin's next podcast, where he'll be interviewing Elon Musk about drilling for natural gas in Texas.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
awesome.
everybody.
Thanks. Bye.